Contributions of Rachel Carson to Environmental Health. Rachel Carson was born in Springdale, Pennsylvania in 1907 and lived in a small farmhouse with her mother and two older siblings. Her mother's love for nature influenced her curiosity and love for the natural environment around her. Rachel lived on a 65-acre farm and she spent a lot of time exploring the forests and streams. She became very passionate about the nature surrounding her. During her young years, she reportedly wrote her first article when she was 10 years old. Rachel attended Pennsylvania College for Women in 1925, during a time when most women did not consider college and when women had been given the right to vote only 5 years prior. She originally began her studies as an English major, but later changed to biology and graduated in 1929 with honors and a scholarship to continue at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Here, she earned a degree in marine zoology in 1932 while the country was in the Great Depression. Because of the hard financial times during the Depression, she could not afford to obtain her PhD, so she earned her master's in biology. Carson was hired by the United States Bureau of Fisheries in Washington, D.C. as a junior aquatic biologist, and she wrote articles on the natural history subjects for the Baltimore Sun newspaper. Rachel later became the editor-in-chief for every publication the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service produced. In 1952, she left her job and devoted herself to writing after the success of her previous writings, The Sea Around Us and The Edge of the Sea. Although she had devoted her life to the underwater world, she was still greatly concerned about the land and environmental health. In 1960, Carson was diagnosed with breast cancer, but still managed to have the first of Silent Spring published in 1962. Rachel Carson began researching at the insistence of a neighbor as to why all the songbirds and mosquitoes had died in her yard. Silent Spring was then published in 1962 in 3 installments by The New Yorker, and later as a single volume by the Huffington Mifflin. As noted by this author, hell broke loose with scientists, politicians, and especially the executives of the chemical companies, threatening to destroy her and voicing negative comments to her controversial writings. Deemed a hysterical female, bird and bunny lover, and charlatan, to name a few, a vicious campaign was launched to discredit her as a scientist. An agricultural trade organization even developed counter-arguments to Carson's claims in an effort to discredit her. Another reason that Rachel possibly fueled the media is the fact that she was a woman, and in the early 1960s, A woman speaking out as she did was hailed by the women, but was frowned upon by the men. Even worse was the fact that she was a woman scientist at a time when women were not welcome in the field nor in the laboratories. Silent Spring brought public awareness to the chemicals that were being used and the harm that they were inflicting on the environment as well as the human race. Carson was not intimidated by the people that were threatened by her book because she wanted the public to know the facts in hopes of gaining more stricter environmental laws. During Rachel's time period, the U.S. was now internationally deemed a superpower culturally, economically, and militarily. But science and technology were the fields that the country most proudly displayed its powers. This was the age when space exploration, television, and automobiles, which were manufactured on a mass scale and changed the socio-economic status for many. During the time, farmers were very successful in producing crops due to DDT eliminating pests that previously destroyed crops. The National Academy of Sciences reported that DDT use had prevented more than 500 million deaths by malaria, which touted its usefulness. Through all the controversy, Carson would not be bullied by the chemical companies and gave accounts all over the country of studies that showed how pesticides traveled through our soil and water systems and became lodged in the fatty tissue of human and animal bodies. In 1963, Carson testified to President John F. Kennedy's Scientific Advisory Committee, which was formed to research environmental dangers, and her speech thereby spurred on the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which we now know as the EPA, and the first environmental laws. Silent Spring became known as the book that started the environmental movement, revealing that pesticides like DDT and other chemicals were harming the environment and having a negative effect on wildlife and human life. Rachel Carson advocated for pesticides to be used with caution. Carson's research showed that DDT, which in the 1950s was being used on crops all over the world, was harmful to the ecosystems and humans. Her book influenced the shift of the conservative movement of the 1890s into the 1960s environmental movement, which led to federal agencies being created to protect the environment. The push for environmental protection was so important at the time due to the U.S. and other countries using pesticides to increase food production and the chemical industry's monetary interests without regard to the environment. The book came to be the Bible for campaigners for the environment, and Carson was compared to Darwin as being the greatest biologist since him. With the environmental movement came a wave of legislation, all sparked by Rachel Carson. The United States Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, issued the Fight Against Environmental Pollution a year after Silent Spring was published. Within the next several years, the Clean Air Act of 1963, the Water Quality Act of 1965, the Motor Vehicle Air Pollution Control Act of 1965, the Endangered Species Act of 1996, and the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970 were passed by Congress, all of which gave the government more control over the direct regulation of the environment. If the Clean Air Act of 1963 had not been passed, the manufacturers of automobiles would not have invested in reducing air pollutants. In 1970, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, was founded, and pesticide use was regulated, along with the establishment of tolerance levels. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act added stricter guidelines in 1972 to protect humans and environmental health. Carson's contributions are still applied today when it comes to protecting the public from environmental health hazards. Examples of the public health approach to chemical exposures: surveillance and data collection, monitoring of chemicals in environmental media such as air, water, consumer products, and food, biomonitoring, which is measuring chemical levels in human samples such as blood and urine, data collection on chemical exposures and releases, tracking health outcomes that could be environmentally related, research, toxicology research, and epidemiology research, investigation of incidents, releases, and clusters, emergency preparedness and response, vulnerability assessment, risk reduction, emergency preparedness and response planning, implementation and evaluation of interventions, primary prevention to reduce chemical exposures, examples, green chemistry, and community health exposures, health screening and health care, policies, laws, and regulations that protect public health, decision support, as in risk assessment, promulgation and enforcement, evaluation, education, and communication, public education, including risk communication, and also professional training and capacity building. An example of how Carson's contributions can be applied today is with the argument that the EPA should regulate artificial light at night. Some of the negative effects of light pollution are glares, which causes loss of contrast in the eyes, which can blind you temporarily and lead to unsafe driving conditions. Research has noted that long-term sleep disruption leads to fatigue and can lead to severe health and safety problems. It also noted that in areas where there's a lot of light pollution, women were found to be more likely to have breast cancer than women that live in darker areas. With application to Rachel Carson's approach, the EPA and non-government organizations may have a call for action to step in and take action to privately regulate light pollution and lessen the negative effects through certification regimes, insurance premium incentives, and corporate social responsibility until the government exerts regulatory control. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring brought much controversy towards the famed author and biologist, but the public became engaged and began thinking about the chemicals and what effect they were having on the environment and human life. One of the people, former Vice President Al Gore, credited Carson with inaugurating a new era of environmental concern, a watershed moment of new vision and activism. Rachel Carson brought out new developments in toxicology, epidemiology, and environmental health. She is considered a major player of the global environmental movement. Through the contributions of Rachel Carson to public health, laws and policies were developed for the protection of the public through environmental protection. She brought the knowledge to the public and lawmakers of how the environment we live in affects all living things.